reality, captured in user-friendly symbols and processed for understanding. The Idea Channel.
Dr. Milton Friedman.
I am very glad indeed to be here with you to talk about this problem, because there is no place in the country where the problem of how to put learning back in the classroom is more important than in this particular area of New York. I need spend no time whatsoever on the proposition that the state of schooling, elementary, secondary, higher schooling in the United States is deplorable. That evidence is available for all of us to see. It is a conclusion that all of us recognize and are aware of. At the lower levels, we have seen problems arise, particularly in the major cities and particularly in the inner cities. We have seen problems of discipline, problems of schools becoming places for keeping people rather than for schooling and educating people. Throughout the country, SAT scores, college board scores have been going down for some 15 or 20 years. At every level, we have a deplorable state of our present educational system. And as I say, I need spend very little time over the fact that it is a problem about which we should be very much aware and about which it is essential to try to do something. There are two fundamental questions. The first is why? What has happened? Why is it that education in the United States today is in so deplorable a state? And of course, the second question is, what can we do about it? Is there some way in which, by taking thought and acting, we can turn the direction of movement around? Instead of the problem getting worse and worse and worse, we can turn it around and get it better and better and better. I want to direct my attention first to the question of why. Why are we in this spot? And then I want to turn to the question of what we can do about it. In my opinion, there are two fundamental reasons why the problems that have developed in schooling are what they are and have developed the way they have. The one reason, the immediate reason, the reason that we can all see is the increasing centralization and bureaucratization of schooling. Education has increasingly become centralized, has increasingly moved away from the control of the local community to the control of broader and broader communities. It has moved away from control of the parents to control by educational administrators. Now, there is nothing wrong with educational administrators. They are fine people. Indeed, some of my best friends are educational administrators. So I have no prejudice against them. But as in every area, the question is the ultimate task of schooling the children running the administrators? Or are the administrators running that task? Who's in the saddle? This tendency toward increasing centralization and bureaucratization is the direct way in which the schooling problem has become worse. But it reflects a deeper force. On a deeper level, what it reflects is a change in the basic philosophy in our society on the relation between the individual on the one hand and the society on the other. I believe that in part what is happening in schooling is a manifestation of a force that is having effects on a much broader area over many other phenomena. And I want to come, in discussing more fully the reasons for the deplorable state of public education to how this change in basic philosophy is related to the problem of schooling in particular. Let me start on a very much broader level. There's a British physician by the name of Dr. Max Gammon who spent the past 5 years studying the British health system, the nationalized medicine in Britain. And on the basis of his study, he formulated a theory which he calls the theory of bureaucratic displacement. Now, this theory is really an extension of the famous law by F. Northcote Parkinson the historian. Some of you may remember that he's written a number of books that are supposedly humorous but are really very serious. And the major thrust of his law, of Parkinson's law, is that work expands to fill the time available. Another version of it, another element of it, is that spending always increases to exhaust whatever funds are available. Dr. Gammon's version of it is a rather different one. In his version of it, he says, in any large bureaucratic organization, useless work tends to displace useful work. The more bureaucratic an organization is, the larger the fraction of the people who are spending their time on shuffling papers, and the fewer the people who are producing useful things. Input goes up, and output goes down. Now, Dr. Gammon developed this on the basis of the British medical system. He showed in the British health system that the number of people employed in the system was going up, and the number of hospital days of beds occupied was going down. But the U.S. education system gives an even better illustration of that tendency. The evidence is really striking. In the 5 years from 1971 to the school year 71-2 to the school year 76-7, in that 5-year period, the total professional staff in all schools in the United States, this is for the United States as a whole, the total professional staff went up 8%. The cost per pupil went up 68%. Now, much of that was due to inflation. But even if you take out the inflation effect, the cost per pupil went up 21%. So input went up. More people, more money. What about output? Well, the number of students went down 4%. The number of schools went down 4%. And needless to say, if instead of looking only at measures of quantity, you were also to look at measures of quality, the quality of the output went down too. The SAT scores, the scores on college board exams, the scores on all sorts of common tests show that the performance has been declining. Similarly, reading levels in the elementary and secondary schools have been going down. The level of math performance has been going down. So here you have 5 years in which you're spending more to hire more people, and on the other side, the number of students you're teaching and the number of schools you're teaching is going down, and the quality is going down. I do not have strictly comparable figures for New York City, but I have some for New York State, and Babette was good enough to provide me with a few for New York City just before. For the nation as a whole, the cost per pupil in 5 years went from $829 per pupil per year to $1,395 per pupil per year, to $1,400. That's countrywide. In the state of New York, it is $1,991. In New York City, it is $2,700. And I think that nobody would show any surprise that the higher the expenditure per pupil, the lower has been the quality of teaching per pupil. So even these comparisons across states in the country tend to suggest what an important addition to our scientific knowledge Dr. Gannon has produced in his law of bureaucratic displacement. I may say that the costs in New York State are the highest in the nation, except only for Alaska. And the reason costs are higher in Alaska, of course, is very clear. It has nothing to do with the same kinds of problems. It's just that all the costs in Alaska are higher, and that all the wages, prices, and everything are much higher because of the distance and the cost of getting stuff there. But after Alaska, New York is the highest. Now, it will come as no surprise to you that the next highest state in the nation is my own home state, Illinois. And I guess there is perhaps little argument that New York and Illinois, and especially New York City and the city of Chicago, and especially in those two cities, in the poorest areas, in the areas of black occupation, black residency, that those areas have among the lowest educational quality in the nation. So you'll have a crystal clear illustration of the tendency that the more you centralize authority and bureaucratize it, the more it costs you to produce less and less. Now, what about the relationship between centralization on the one hand and bureaucracy on the other? Well, in the same 5-year period, the number of school districts went down 10%. Number of schools, number of pupils went down 4%. The number of school districts went down 10%. You were continuing the process towards centralization, bigger school districts. Again, I don't have the figures for the exact same period, but for a slightly earlier period, an earlier 5-year period, the teaching staff went up 14%. But the supervisors went up 44%. This is exactly what Dr. Gammon found for the British Medical Service. As the total number of personnel expanded, the group that expanded most rapidly were the bureaucratic supervisors, organizers, and the like. And now the question is, why is it? Why should increasing centralization, increasing bureaucratization have the effect of increasing input and reducing output? Why should it have that effect? Here, in many other ways, we all have the hope and belief that, after all, if you're big, you're efficient, that mass production reduces costs, increases output. Why in this area should centralization and bureaucratization have the opposite effect? Well, the answer is very clear. In the other areas, you have a consumer and you have a producer. Other enterprises can get bigger only as they can produce a product more cheaply. They can attract somebody to buy it. The only way you can get a big company is by producing goods that you can sell. But in the case of schooling, that isn't the situation. The consumer is the parent and the child. The producer is the teacher and the school administrator. And unfortunately, from the point of view of quality and efficiency, centralization in this area reduces the impact of the consumer on the producer. If you're dealing with a small local area, even in a school system in which there is no direct payment for schooling, in which it is financed by the government through taxes, even in that, if you deal with a small local area, there's a good deal of interconnection between the local parents and the local teachers. The parents can have a good deal of input. The more you broaden the area of control, the more difficult it is for the parent to have much of an input. So the effect of centralization has been to put the producer in the charge and in the saddle, and to reduce the feedback from the consumer. What you do is take the control out of the hands of the parents and put control in the hands of the professional educator. In New York City, as you all realize, what you do is take control out of the hands of the parents and put it in the hands of Albert Shanker. Now again, Mr. Shanker may be an excellent person. I don't know him. I've never met him. I have no quarrel with him as an individual. But his objectives are not the same as the objectives of the parents. He is serving a different clientele. He isn't getting his income and his power by satisfying the parents. He is getting his income, his power, and his clientele by satisfying a very different group with very different objectives. This phenomenon is not at all special to schooling. Wherever government bureaucracy takes over, costs go up and quality goes down. That's no less true of the post office than it is of the schooling system. It's no less true of garbage collection than it is of the schooling system. You know, there have been a number of studies made of this kind of phenomenon. Many cities around the United States have private garbage collection. That is to say, people pay privately to private firms to collect their garbage. A number of studies have been made comparing the costs of that private garbage collection with the cost of garbage collection when it is done by a municipality. The answer always turns out to be the same. It costs just roughly twice as much to do it by a municipality as it does to do it by private means. Again, if you look at the post office, it's hard to find any area in our society in which the quality of the product has shown less improvement over the last 100 years than in the post office. In fact, I think there are many people who would say the quality of the product has gone down, not up. And the cost has certainly gone up. The cost, there are very few items that the consumer buys whose price has risen as much as the price of mailing a first-class letter. Costs have gone up, quality has gone down. Again, there's a small town in Arizona which has a private fire department. It's a private enterprise fire department. The costs of fire protection in that town, Scottsdale, Arizona, are roughly half the costs of municipal fire protection in those towns that have municipal fire protection. A study was made some time ago of the efficiency of clerks in handling pieces of paper in the Social Security office in Washington and in a private insurance office. And lo and behold, the clerks in the private insurance office did twice as much work in the same amount of time as the clerks in the government office. Again, this isn't because government employees are bad people. They're not. They're human beings like you and me. It isn't because the private people are better people. They're not. It's because in the case of the private arrangements, the customer has something to say. In the case of the governmental arrangements, the customer has very little to say and the producer is in the saddle. If we go back to our educational problem, note that the complaints about the quality of education are least in the small towns, where there is the closest connection between the parents on the one hand and the way the school is conducted on the other, and are greatest in the large towns, in the inner cities in particular, where the administration and running of the schools are most separated from the parents. Now let me turn to my more fundamental reason. Why is it that the role of government in education has been increasing? Why is it that the parents have been given less control and the administrators more? And the increasing role of government in education is true not only at the elementary level, not only at the secondary level, it's also true at the university and college level. Fundamentally, I believe, it reflects it's part of a general shift from the philosophy of individual responsibility that prevailed in the 19th and early 20th century to an increasing belief in social responsibility. The view of the 19th century view was that an individual was fundamentally responsible for himself. It was up to him to make his way in the world. He was responsible for his success, and he had to bear the responsibility for his failures. Of course, everybody realized then that an individual was much affected by the circumstances of the society, that an individual who was fortunate enough to be in the United States could do a lot better with his life than an individual who was born in India or in Africa or in a less developed country. So this wasn't to say that society didn't matter, but it was to say that the function of government and of the social setting was to provide the individual with the maximum opportunity to express his own values, to develop his own capacities in accordance with his own values, own beliefs. The modern view is very different. The modern view has become, I shouldn't say has become, became, because I think it's now changing. But the modern view became that after all, an individual was an innocent puppet pushed one way or another by the social forces that impinged on him. That you couldn't blame an individual for anything, that wasn't his fault. It was society that was responsible. That the ultimate unit of our society was a collectivity rather than the individual. That you had social responsibility, not individual responsibility. And this was associated with a view that there were experts, people who knew what was good for people better than they did for themselves. That after all, you couldn't let an individual decide what he was going to do because he might make the wrong choice. And it was up to those of us who were in the elite class, who knew more about what was right, who had the proper social point of view, not to dictate to the individual, of course, but to guide him in the right direction, to make sure that he did what was good for himself. And that tendency has manifested itself very strongly in our school systems. In the 19th century, the schools, even in crowded cities and in urban cities, might not have been affluent, they might not have had the best facilities, but they had an atmosphere in which the individual was made responsible for his own development and own learning, and he was given an opportunity to learn and develop. And that was a concept. In the 20th century, the concept has been that the schools are an expression of society's values and interests and should be imposed upon the child, and that the child should be made to do what's good for him, and that the major problem in schooling was to get the child out of the hands of his ignorant and not very sophisticated parents and put the child in the hands of the sophisticated and knowledgeable educational experts who could guide him along the correct way. Similarly, if you look at the very simple problem of discipline, if you look at the very simple problem of physical destruction, if I have a philosophy that everything belongs to society, and that if something bad happens to me, that's not my fault, that's because this bad society did it to me, then the whole concept of property loses its role. Why shouldn't I steal? Why shouldn't I destroy property? After all, it's nobody's. It belongs to everybody, so it belongs to nobody. It's society's. And moreover, the fact that I happen to be accidental, I happen to be in a lower income group or in a deprived social group or in a discriminated against racial group, that's the malevolence of other people. It's not my fault, and I have every right to get back at them. So that the whole concept of social responsibility, the whole reduction in the sense of individual responsibility, tends to denigrate the respect which the individual has for himself. It tends to remove from the individual his own feeling of importance and significance. It tends to convert him into an atom who is being moved about by other forces on the one side, and on the other side, it tends to promote in another group a sense of controlling people rather than assisting them. This, I may say that this shift in philosophy has been accompanied, therefore, for obvious reasons, with a shift in the whole concept of America from the concept of the melting pot to the concept of ethnic separatism. The 19th century conception was that we should become a unified nation by all of us as individuals, partaking in a common culture, a common heritage. The whole justification for governmental public schooling was in order to provide a common framework so you could have citizens who could harmoniously exist together in a single, free, democratic society. The concept today has tended to go in the other direction. I believe in a very diverse society. I believe it's highly desirable to preserve variety and diversity and different kinds of things. But it has to be a variety and a diversity within a uniform set of standards, a uniform set of institutions, ideas. What can we do about it? Let me turn to the second and the more immediately important point for action. The answer to what to do is very simple. There is no difficulty in saying what changes would alter beyond belief the character, quality, and climate of education. But the problem of how to get that done is not easy and not straightforward. The crucial problem, the problem that I feel most frustrated about, is the political problem of getting done what needs to be done. The way to bring learning back into the classroom, the way to make sure that schools are responsive to the needs of the children they have in their classroom, is to give parents more power, more control over their own children's schooling. The parents have the greatest interest in their own children's schooling. They are the ones who are involved. They are the ones who should have the power to control the kind of schooling their children have. Some of them, if they got the power, would make a mess of it. Of course. But a mess is now being made on a much broader scale. But most of them would not make a mess of it. I think that there has been a terrible tendency for some of our intellectual community to underestimate both the interest and the capacity of the citizens with whom they deal to do something for their own children and to improve the kind of opportunity that their children have. Now, how can you give parents more power? Here's a very simple scheme for doing so. It's a scheme that is very old that I personally happen to have been trying to recommend and propose now for over 20 years. It's called the Voucher plan. And this plan is a very simple one. It says you're a parent, you're sending your children to school, the government is providing public schools for your children to go to. If you decide if you would like to send your child to another school, a private school, you're saving the city money. The city doesn't have to spend, the city of New York today doesn't have to spend $2,728 per pupil to school those children who are going to non-public schools. Well, therefore, the city should say, very well, if you relieve us of the expense of schooling your child, we will give you a voucher, a piece of paper, worth a certain sum of money, which you may use for one purpose and one purpose only, to pay the cost of schooling your child in any school you want to go to. Now, I say the city of New York would save $2,728, but I want to make this proposal attractive to everybody, and I think it would be very attractive to parents if instead of their getting a voucher for $2,728, they were to get a voucher for $2,000 or $1,500 or $1,000. In the usual rule, I would estimate that to have schooling provided privately of better quality would cost half as much. So that if you gave parents $1,500, they would be able to acquire with that better schooling than they're now getting for the $2,700 that is being spent on their account. Well, then the voucher scheme would say, any parent who chooses to send his child to a school other than the governmental public school is entitled to a voucher which he can use for the payment of tuition and costs at that school. It's exactly the same principle that was applied after World War II and much more recently in the so-called GI Bill for returning veterans. They chose their school. This was at the college level. They went to the University of Chicago, or they went to Notre Dame, or they went to NYU or City College, or wherever they went to, and they were entitled to receive, as long as they could show they were going to school, they were entitled to receive so much per month. In that case, a voucher covered not only tuition, but also living expenses. That's in its simplest form the idea of the voucher plan. I may say, it does not in any way raise any problem about the quality of the schools. Because if you think of private schools that might be established for this purpose that don't exist, they would have to satisfy present requirements. Under our present compulsory education laws, no school can be treated as a school whose students satisfy that law unless it meets certain minimum standards. So I'm not touching a thing about that. Those minimum standards would stand. But what you would have instead would be that parents would be able to control the school their children went to. If they liked the public school, they could send them to the public school. If they didn't, they would have another alternative. Now let me note that today, those of us who are lucky enough to be in the upper income classes have that choice. We can send our children to private schools because we can afford to pay twice for the schooling of our children. We can afford to pay once in taxes and then say, okay, that's going to go down the drain. We'll pay a second time by sending our children to a private school. But those in the lower income classes and those in the middle income classes, for the most part, do not have this same opportunity. They cannot afford to pay twice for schooling. They are now paying through the nose in the form of taxes, and they cannot afford again to pay directly. Now, many parents in the lower and the middle income groups have made tremendous personal sacrifices in order to do that, in order to pay a second time. But I believe it is fundamentally an invasion of their rights, a violation of their rights, to force them to engage in that kind of sacrifice for that purpose. What this proposal for the voucher scheme does is to make available to lower and middle income parents the same range of alternatives that those of us in the upper income classes have now. Now, what good would the voucher plan do? It would do exactly the same good that competition does in every other area. How do you get good quality products in other areas? What is it that keeps supermarkets trying to serve its customers? Why is it that we have had an enormous improvement in the quality of supermarkets in the past 20, 30 years, but we've had a deterioration in the quality of schools? Look at what's happened in the area of hi-fi. You take any area. What produces an improvement in quality is a competition among different people for the custom of the citizen. And what the effect of the voucher plan would be to introduce competition in schooling. In addition, the effect of the voucher plan would be to hold down costs. Now, let me note that the effect of the voucher plan would be to improve the public schools as well as the private ones, because public schools would lose their customers. Now, they have a captive market. Their customers, their clients, or should I say their prisoners, have nowhere else to go. Give them some competition. Make them shape up or close down. If under a voucher scheme they continue to offer poor schooling, well, then the parents will take the children out and send them to private schools, and the public schools will have to contract and close down. In reaction to that, the public schools would have an enormous incentive to improve the quality of their education. Now, I have discussed at great length elsewhere the virtues, the problems, the arguments for, the arguments against the voucher. I only want to cover them here today in very brief compass because I want to devote what time I have left to why the voucher plan is so difficult to get adopted. I may say only that the voucher plan would resolve every present critical problem in the school system. It would resolve the problem of discipline. You do not have discipline problems in schools to which parents have voluntarily chosen to send their children. You compare today commercial trade schools which train people for a vocation, and the people who go there have to pay for training. They have no discipline problems, because if the customer there, if the student is spending his own money, he wants to get his money's worth. And similarly, if you have the parents and the children who are spending money that is available to them, you won't have a discipline problem. If you do, parents will pull their children out and send them somewhere else. Second place, the voucher plan would solve the integration problem. The fundamental obstacles to integration, in my opinion, have been the desire of parents to maintain the quality of their schooling their children get. It has not been fundamentally the racial problem. In any event, in a voucher plan, you would have other factors that would enter in that would simply take the place of the whole integration problem. Parents would be free to send their children to whatever kind of schools they wanted, and know what would happen. All schools would not be the same. Some of them would concentrate on vocational activities, and parents whose children were interested in that would go to those schools. Some of the schools might concentrate on the arts. Some might concentrate on the sciences. I don't have a good enough imagination to figure what would be the whole variety of kinds of schools that you would develop. If you look at the variety we have developed in every other area, do you know that we spend as much more in this country on schooling than we do on foods? More on schooling than we do on restaurants? There's no shortage of variety of restaurants. There are restaurants for every appetite, for every taste. Turn the forces of competition and the incentive of that volume of money free, and you will have schools of every variety appealing to every taste to serve every need. The voucher plan would solve the busing problem. There might very well end up to be more busing, but it would be voluntary, not compulsory, because parents would then bus because they wanted to send their children to a superior school or to a school that was more nearly suited to the particular interests or problems of that child. So as I say, I think that this plan would resolve all of our present critical problems and would not itself raise any other problems of major importance. But as I say, I have discussed all those advantages and disadvantages elsewhere, and I want to go rather to the question. If the voucher plan is so attractive, why hasn't it been adopted? What stopped it? And here I have had a great deal of personal experience on this subject, and I have been increasingly frustrated, increasingly aware of the difficulties. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, a group in Washington at the Office of Economic Opportunity and later the Institute of Education was very much interested in trying to promote experiments in voucher schemes. And they offered money for experimental voucher programs. They offered to fund the costs of designing them, of setting them up, and of meeting the initial costs. Quite a number of states and cities expressed an interest. The one I was closest to was New Hampshire, because it happens to be near my second home in Vermont, my summer home in Vermont. The head of the New Hampshire Board of Education, the governmental, not the, I'm not using the right term. He was not the civil servant in charge of education, but the top political official in charge of education, was absolutely sold on the voucher scheme. He was determined to put it through, and he worked his head off to try to get it by. Washington made grants. A half a dozen different cities initially expressed an interest in it. It was never tried anywhere. Why? Because of the effective and determined opposition of the educational bureaucracy. Over and over again it was stymied, not by the teachers, but by the educational bureaucrats. And the reason was very simple. They could see that this would destroy their power. This is a straightforward issue. If parents can choose, then administrators cannot dictate. If schools have to shape up or shut down, well then they are under real pressure to conform to the demands and the tastes and the desires of their students. And so wherever this has come up, the educational administrators have opposed it. That happened in New Hampshire. It happened in Connecticut, where there was a group, a town, Hartford I think it was, I forget the exact town, in which the superintendent of schools, in this case an educational bureaucrat himself, was strongly in favor of it. But he could not persuade his teachers or administrative staff. The only place in the country where there was even a vestige of a voucher experiment was in a small town in California called Alum Rock. And it was a fake. It wasn't a real honest-to-God voucher experiment because all the choices were restricted to public schools. What it turned out to be was a way in which the educational administrators were very imaginative, and they saw an opportunity as to way they could get some extra federal funding. And they did, but even so, the program was interesting, because what they did was to establish within the public school system a variety of sub-schools. And they established an arrangement under which parents had some measure of choice about which school their child went to. And the evaluation which was made of that experiment by the Rand Corporation subsequently came to the conclusion that there had been a distinct improvement in the quality of education and in the satisfaction of the parents with the system. So it was a very tortured experiment, but the results were in the right direction. Now, in my opinion, the political problem is dramatized by the inner cities. That's why I'm so glad to be talking right here. Because I believe that's where vouchers would do the most good and where we need them most. If I ask myself in what respect are blacks, and especially poor blacks, most discriminated against? How are they most deprived? Anybody who lives here in Harlem can buy the same automobile as somebody who lives out in the country if he has some money to pay for it. But he can't get the same kind of schooling. There is no doubt that the respect in which he's worst off is in the kind of schooling he can get for his child. The better off can do fine. They can move out to suburbs where they have the equivalent of private schools. They can send their children to private schools. But the poor people, the people who are stuck in the inner city areas, they have no choice. And they get a very, very low quality of schooling. And yet, I have tried over and over again, in my own city of Chicago in particular, where I have had more contacts, to try to interest leaders of the black community in promoting and pushing the voucher scheme. And I have almost always failed miserably. Why? All of these leaders whom I am talking about, almost without exception, send their own children to private schools. Just as, on the national level, most of the white legislators who have been most stridently in favor of compulsory busing send their children to private schools. So why have the black leaders opposed? The answer is crystal clear. As long as the schools are governmental, as long as they are financed and administered by political entities, they are a source of political power. They are a way in which the politically ambitious can improve their lot. On the other hand, no black leader in an inner city can make political hay out of supermarkets. If you had a voucher system and you had a widespread system of private schools, you no longer would have any political leverage through the school system for patronage, for influencing votes, for having influence in other areas. And as a result, I have found it extremely difficult to interest the leaders of the black communities in Chicago. Very often, many of them will express an interest and say it's a fine idea, but I never hear anything further from it. It drops like a rock into the ocean. But the picture is not completely dark by any manner of means. As the educational problem gets worse and worse, there is more and more clamor to do something about it. Not only here in New York, but throughout the country. Parents have become increasingly concerned and increasingly active in trying to get some change. The emergence of this group here in New York is a great source of hope. Equally, I know of at least 2 national organizations that have developed for the purpose of getting a greater degree of freedom for parents to control the schooling of their children. There's a CEF, the Citizens for Educational Freedom, which started in St. Louis, now has a national office in New York. There's the National Association for Personal Rights in Education, started in Chicago by Professor Frank Brown at Loyola University. There is right at this moment a bill before the Illinois legislature proposing the equivalent of vouchers in schooling in the state of Illinois. The people who are promoting that think they have not necessarily a chance of getting it passed this year, but a good chance of getting it out of the committee and onto the floor and at least under consideration. The CEF group, the Citizens for Educational Freedom, are planning a campaign, a petition campaign in the state of Michigan to try to get a constitutional amendment which would mandate the use of vouchers in schooling on the ballot for next year's election. I don't say that'll happen, and I don't say that if it's on the ballot it'll get passed. It will not. We know the problem. We had an experience along that line in Michigan last year with another amendment. This was an amendment which attempted to set a limit on total spending by the state of Michigan as a percentage of the income of the people of Michigan to hold down the continued tendency for the state expenditures to grow. Who do you suppose ended up beating that? It was a Michigan Educational Association. The Michigan Educational Association, a month, 2 months before the election, straw votes were showing a 2-to-1 majority in favor of the amendment. In the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign, the Michigan Educational Association threw $500,000 roughly into the campaign, a sum which was 4 or 5 times as large as the whole amount of money which the proponents of the bill had spent. And they conducted a media blitz in newspaper and radio and television, and ended up defeating the proposal by 54 to 46, I think it was. Well, I have no doubt that if the proponents of this manage to get enough signatures to put on the ballot an amendment mandating a voucher, you will have exactly the same kind of event over again. The Michigan Educational Association will fight it tooth and nail. So I do not mean to say that the road is easy, but I only say that first, we know what the right thing to do is. And second, there is support for it. There are people who are interested in this. There are possibilities of moving in this direction. And it is the most promising direction. It is the only way I can see that we have a hope of turning around the trend that has been going on. So I say to you, go to it, parents. You have everything to gain for your children. Thank you. You go ahead.
My name is Elijah Boyd. I'm the U.S. Labor Party candidate for mayor of what's left of New York City. Now, there are so many objectionable things that you've said in your talk that in the interests of getting at the bottom of your philosophy and the institutions that you represent, as opposed to the philosophy and institutions that I represent, I would like to challenge you to an open public debate on economic policy and how we get the world out of this depression.
Well, I'm afraid that's not the subject matter of this session today. It's a subject I have talked extensively about. Whether it is a most effective use of my time to debate you publicly in New York is a different question. Whether it is or not, it's not, I'm afraid, within the bounds of reason at the moment. So do you have a question you would like to raise about the content of what I have said here tonight?
Yeah, you specifically excluded mention of 2 things, namely the public unions, and secondly, the massive growth of debt service and public indebtedness of New York City, which is by and large the most important problem in not merely the educational system here, but the fact that this entire city is being subjected to the kind of Hayalmar Shaktian economics that is causing this city to virtually disappear. It is precisely the kind of economic policies that you have proposed and saw implemented in Chile that you are representing right here in this discussion.
Let us try to see if we can get out the little element of your comment which is really relevant to our discussion here. So far as trade unions are concerned, there is no doubt that the emergence of strong city unions has been a serious element of the problem of not only New York City as a whole, but of the educational problem. It's part of the reason why the costs of schooling in this city are so high. Again, a voucher system, by providing alternatives, by providing competition, would tend to reduce the possibility of the control which the unions have exercised, the stranglehold which they have been able to exercise. I have no objections to unions, provided there are alternatives and they are voluntary. As to the interest cost and the debt service, that really has very little to do with why it is that current operating costs of schools in New York City, independent of interest, independent of capital costs, are the highest in the nation.
That is an outright lie, and that's why I challenge you to a debate.
Well, I am sorry. I think we have given you a chance. I think we will take the next question.
All right, Dr. Freeman. My name is Bill Hall. I have 2 questions to ask.
Yes, sir.
We hear a lot said against public education by people such as yourself and others. Can you tell me and those in the audience who are those that are advocating the present system? Are there people who are talking about the present system?
What do you mean, who are the people who are advocating the present system?
You indicate that you find some problems with the way schools are currently run.
I would suppose that that was the understatement of the evening.
Right. Okay. What I'm interested in is that there does not seem to be a debate. There does not seem to be people on the other side advocating what exists.
Nobody is advocating what exists.
Okay.
But the self-interest of people on the other side is keeping them from accepting the only effective cure.
Who are those individuals or organizations?
Those individuals or organizations?
Yes.
Well, as I was mentioning before, in the cases in which I have had direct contact with them, in Michigan, they're the Michigan Educational Association. In the city of New York, I take it they're the American Federation of Teachers. I take it they are in New Hampshire, where I had contact with them. They were the superintendents of schools. They were the local board, some of the local representatives of the educational administration, the superintendent of schools, the supervisors, and so on. Now, all of them recognize the problems. Many of them recognize the problems, of course. But they are in a bind because they regard what I believe is the only effective solution, which is greater power to parents, as a threat to their position. As I said before, I have no quarrel with them as individuals. They're decent human beings. They're not doing this because they want to produce bad education. I never would say anything like that at all. On the contrary, I think, especially among the teaching staffs, there are many devoted, dedicated teachers who, under terrible conditions, are trying to do the best they can. All I'm saying is I can only see one effective way to enable them really to do it. I may say, I don't believe teachers in general are opposed to the voucher system. I have talked to many teachers who have said to me, I would much rather teach in the kind of schooling system that would develop under a voucher arrangement, where the students would be coming there of their own free will, where they would be choosing my school to come to. I would much rather teach in that kind of a school, but I don't have that possibility now. So I'm not questioning the intent or the desires or the aims of people. They are caught up in a system, and they are in a box where they believe, erroneously I think, that their self-interest would be hurt by shifting to a voucher scheme. My own belief is that the teachers would be among the biggest beneficiaries of a voucher system. They would be able to do their job. They would no longer have to be disciplinarians.
The reason I ask that question is that it certainly doesn't endear many of us who are a part of that enterprise that you're criticizing when there doesn't seem to be any effective options currently. The other question that I have deals with the voucher system.
Sure.
Is it the intent of the voucher system to break up the monolith, to make public education more dynamic, more competitive?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If the voucher system were uniformly applied, you see, the next stage is to apply it to the public school system itself. The next stage is to say, not only those parents who choose to take their child out of the school, but every parent will get a voucher. And he can use it anywhere he wants to. If he wants to use it at a public school, he can use it at a public school. And then the public schools would have to charge a tuition equal to the sum on the voucher, and they would have to finance themselves out of the proceeds from the voucher. As I said, I believe that the vouchers system is the only system that will save the public schools. It won't destroy the public schools. On the contrary, how can you destroy a system more effectively than it's destroying itself now? I have nothing to offer in that direction. They have everything to teach me. But what the voucher system would do would be to offer a way to turn that thing around and provide a creative move and a movement toward improving the public school system rather than making it worse. Look, I personally grew up in a small town in New Jersey. I went to a public elementary school. I went to a public high school. I went to Rutgers University on a state scholarship. So I'm not a person who can really turn up my nose at public schooling, and I'm not trying to do it. And I think that there was a time when it was serving a very, very useful function very effectively. But I think the increasing bureaucratization, the increasing centralization of authority has converted what was at one time a responsive system into an utterly unresponsive machine, which is grinding the students under its wheels as well as the teachers.
Thank you.
My name is Matthew Mead. I'm a member of the faculty of Medgar College of the City University of New York. And I'd like to question you on your voucher system. It seems to me that fundamentally it assumes perfect competition Meaning, of course, that you have a homogeneous product that's being offered to consumers.
Not at all.
I'll continue. That, in fact, there are large numbers of sellers and buyers, and those kinds of things. And additionally, it seems to me that what is not considered, at least you gave very short shrift to, the fact that racism, which of course is an aspect that economic theory has not developed a well-developed theory in order to handle, is sort of like assumed away in your model. Let me suggest that at the higher level, we have, in fact, the voucher system, as you sort of said earlier in your speech. That is that anyone can choose any of the private universities and or state colleges and to go to. However, in this society where racism does exist, what happens is that individuals whose abilities are retarded by environmental racism, etc., do not have the same choice and to go to, for example, the Harvards and Yales and Columbia, as, for example, other students who may not be so afflicted. So what can possibly happen, though, even though under your system, you might have an increase in the general level of scholarship among all students, if in fact there's no relative change within this system, you still have the situation that employees are obviously going to take the best, which is going to be a white upper strata, leave the rest, which is going to be a black and minority lower strata. And in fact, even though all scores, board scores and everything have raised, the level of marginal product has to be met, which is also now higher, you in fact haven't solved the problem. So again, even though it's possible to have an increase in the general level of schooling in the system, you can still be left with the fundamental problem that the people who finish relatively on the lower level are going to be left with their problem. And I think that your voucher system doesn't appeal to that. And we see, for example, now University of California at Davis, for example, the famous Bakke case, where a 35 or 38-year-old man is suing because some students with lower scores entered and so on. So again, to conclude, the fact that the institutions themselves also have a choice in the matter. It's not just the consumer. The producer, the school, can decide not to accept the student if in fact he's filled up his quota with the best of students.
Well,
so your voucher
examine.
system, although it might, as I say, make marginal changes, is not a panacea, and it should not be.
Of course it's not a panacea. There are no panaceas. But in the particular terms you're raising, you've got the situation exactly upside down. In my opinion, there is not a single thing you could do in this world that would do more to improve the condition of the black people who have in the lowest income classes, of the black people who have been most affected by discrimination. There is not anything that you could do that would be more effective than the voucher scheme. Why? Because as I said to you before, and I challenge anybody to deny that there's no respect in which the black in the slum is more deprived than in the quality of schooling he can get. He's much worse off in that respect than he is even in the quality of housing he can get, than in the quality of the automobile he can buy, in the quality of the job he can get with given education. I agree with you that the poor educational qualifications have had further effects carry through life in leading him to have few opportunities to improve his economic conditions. But if we want to improve his economic conditions, we want to enable him to be a more productive, a more valuable, a more useful person. And the way to do that is, first of all, to improve his schooling. And how do we improve his schooling? The only effective device that there is for improving his schooling that anybody has suggested is to give the parents more control, to introduce the competition and the drive of private market to improve the quality of the schooling that is available to them. Now you say, I assume perfect competition, I assume, those are all words. I don't assume anything of the kind. I assume that you have a world of the kind you have. In this world of the kind you have, you do not have perfection. That's for the next world. We'll have to wait till we get there, and we don't look forward to it very much. In this world, you have imperfection. The question is, how do we have the least imperfect world? We're not going to eliminate all problems. We're not going to eliminate feelings of racism. Of course not. But we can try to follow policies which will minimize their adverse effects. We can try to follow policies which will give those people who have a desire to improve their own conditions who have no prejudice, who want to hire people. We want to have a society in which they have the greatest opportunity to do so. By introducing competition, by making it possible to have a variety of different schools and different choices, you say, well, just consider what would happen. If the parents in Harlem, each one of them separately, had the possibility of disposing of $1,500 per child per year for the schooling of that child, do you mean to say that there wouldn't be a flowering of schools of all kinds? I'll bet there are a dozen people in this room who would set up schools to try to meet that demand. Look at what's happened with those small private schools that have been set up under tremendously difficult circumstances. If I go to the other end of the country, if I go to Oakland, California, there's a small preschool school in the suburbs of Oakland set up by the Black Panthers in California. It's the most effective preschool school that there is around there. It's done a better job than any other of the schools in giving the kids who come to it an opportunity really to get an education. So I'm pleading your case, sir. You really, if you'll pardon me, you are repeating in your words formulae you've learned. You are not thinking for yourself.
Sir,
look at the world as it is.
With all due respect, I did say that it is possible to improve generally the school system.
I'm talking
but
about
I said
the
that
bottom.
that does not necessarily mean that if you don't improve positions relatively, that you're going to have any change.
But you would improve
and I say
them
also
relatively.
that the higher university system has provided a kind of laboratory experiment in which crucial problems still exist because you have small numbers of people, minority people, who are able to go to Harvard, to able to go to Yale, your University of Chicago, etc. And I say that those kinds of criticisms must be confronted, because otherwise you now mislead the people that all you have to do is somehow have a kind of free market system and people are going to be able to purchase a product which, for example, unlike in a private firm, he can deny that product to you. If I go to a corporation under the law,
excuse me.
He cannot. But at the university, he can deny admission.
We're going to have to terminate this.
Fine.
But I just want to make one more statement along your line. In every proposal I have ever made for the voucher scheme, I have said that it shall be perfectly consistent with the law that vouchers be usable only in schools which do not discriminate with respect to race. That provision can be made just as effectively under a voucher scheme as it can under any other scheme.
Sir,
and it would be,
I did not say that it would be discriminated on the basis of race. When you go to buy a car, no one's going to ask you whether or not you have dirty clothes or whatnot. If you have effective demand, you're able to purchase a car. If you present yourself at the University of Chicago, you also must present a grade point average, which is a function of the environment and other kinds of considerations.
But that isn't the problem at the first grade.
Well,
the reason you have the problems you cite at the university
the
level,
Head Start program would deny that. I mean, there was
the reason you did not have that. You have the problems at the university level is in large part, not wholly. Of course, you're not going to solve all problems. You're not going to overnight create
life is tough,
heaven on earth. Life is tough. The problem is, how do we move in the right direction? How do we get off of this descent and turn the other way? Let's give some of the other people
let's see. At the age of even 4 years old, there's already deprivation which is set in. So you do have the problem.
Maybe so. I want to do what I can not to intensify that. Let's have the next question. Yes.
Dr. Friedman, my name is George Basak. I'm a lawyer, and I am committed also to the struggle for freedom of educational choice. And I agree wholeheartedly with just about everything you've said. But I feel that maybe it just doesn't go far enough. I identify the issue also as freedom of educational choice, and certainly compulsory governmental education infringes upon that freedom. And I think when we look for the justification for the infringement on the freedom, the only possible one that would make any sense would be the interest of the state in an educated citizenry. The problem, however, is that the means which have been employed to accomplish that objective seem totally foreign to its accomplishment. And the reason I feel that there is another step beyond your comments is that I would identify the failure of that system to accomplish the objective to the fact that government in education is an enterprise. While we speak in terms of competition and so forth, I think that the people who are holding the strings for the construction of schools, for the staffing of schools, and so forth, view it as their own little business. So that I think when we talk in terms of continuing public school systems as opposed to the interest of the state in an educated citizenry, we are in trouble. For example, as an example, let's take your voucher idea. I think that the voucher idea is a great idea, but I see no point to a voucher system for one who has no need of money from the government to educate his children. If we consider, for example, a wealthy person getting a voucher, it would make no sense. Best description I heard was at a meeting of lawyers in which one lawyer said that type of voucher system, that is for everyone, would be like giving yourself a transfusion from the left arm to the right arm and you lose a gallon of blood in the process. You really don't need a voucher for the wealthy person, you just make a greater bureaucracy. I think it's the people here that need the vouchers. And I think that the voucher should be based on need. If we could establish a need factor, then we would need less bureaucracy to handle the vouchers.
On the contrary, you need the bureaucracy to determine need.
Yes, but the number of people whose vouchers would be being handled would be diminished enormously.
No, but I beg your pardon, I don't agree with it all with that view. I think that everybody in this, every man at the moment, whatever his wealth, is under our present laws, whether he should be or not is another question, but under our present laws he is entitled to send his child to a public school. Your argument, if it made sense, your argument would imply that public schools should be available without tuition charge,
No,
only on demonstrated need.
No.
Now every parent, regardless of his income, is now entitled to send his child to a public school. If he chooses not to send his child to the public school, he is saving the community money. He is paying his share of the taxes. And I think it is very important to separate out this question of taxes. If you think that the taxes on the wealthy aren't high enough, then propose higher taxes. But let's not get that mixed up with the problem of education. On the question of compulsion, I have a great deal of sympathy with the view you've expressed. But I like to separate issues. I want to take up one thing at a time. It's hard enough to try to make this one modification. If we succeed in making this one modification, then I will welcome you to join with me perhaps in going further. Because I think that there is a very, on a purely intellectual level, I have very great difficulty with the concept of compulsory schooling. But at the moment we have compulsory schooling. And at the moment I think it is utopian to suppose that we're going to do anything very much about that. We don't have compulsory education. Don't misunderstand that. We don't have any compulsory education at all. We have compulsory schooling. Not all schooling is education. And not all education is schooling.
May I just offer this by way of rebuttal that I think you have demonstrated in talking about the theory of bureaucratic displacement and so forth, that when the government gets into any area of enterprise which involves the individual freedom, it is inevitable that it will overtake the whole enterprise. And I think that to assume that government schooling would continue on a modified basis with this voucher system that you propose, without inevitably, again, eating up the competition because of the tremendous amount of public monies available to it, I think inevitably we'd be right back where we started.
Well, I'm afraid the evidence is not on your side. It so happens that Denmark has maintained this kind of a dual system for something like 100 years. And the free part of the Denmark system, where they have it's a small part of it, most of it is public, but there are also free, what they call free schools, which are essentially a voucher kind of school. They have maintained a stable part of the system for a long time.
I don't think they have the political.
But let me only say to you, I have a good deal of sympathy with that argument too.
Yep.
But here we have a situation where we are. And our problem is how to go from where we are to where we would like to be. Vouchers would involve less bureaucracy than our present system. They would involve less government control than our present system. I don't see any way to create utopia on earth overnight. I think we've got to do it gradually and in a way which is acceptable. Yes.
Dr. Friedman, I'm Barry Farber, conservative candidate for mayor.
Boy, I'm sorry to have gotten involved in this mayoral campaign. I am not a New Yorker, and I am not a mayoral candidate. Let me make one statement to everybody. I am not a mayoral candidate.
I disagree with you sharply in only one respect. I don't think you lack the imagination for anything that you would care to fantasize. You said your imagination was not broad enough to cover what might happen if there were a voucher system. I want you to try to guess what Harlem would look like and live like 1 year after a voucher system. And the second part of the question is, you know, on paper, if you give a parent $3,000, let's say that's the cost per child, the school system breaks even. If you give him $1,500 cash, the school system's $1,500 ahead. But in theory, we know good and well that we're talking about fixed capital expenses, and if you give him $1,500, the city's out $1,500. If you give him $1, the city is out $1 in real money. Now, is there a way to keep from administering too much medicine too fast that might kill the patient? That 3-year-old girl endeared herself to us by saying to her father, what if they gave a war and nobody came? Well, what if they gave a voucher system and everybody came?
Well, in the first place, if they gave a voucher system and everybody came, personally I would regard that as fine. But in the second place, you needn't worry about that problem. And the reason you needn't worry about that problem is because it takes time for alternatives to develop. Just as it takes time for a business to build up and develop and create. And in the same way, if you start on a voucher scheme, I think a year from now, the effect in Harlem would be very small. A year from now, you would see 2 dozen schools around. You would see some dedicated groups of parents mostly, who would have organized themselves into setting up voucher schools, and they would be able to use the money they got from the vouchers. I think if you look 5 years ahead, the story would be different. By that time, you would have a great many prosperous enterprises in Harlem. If you want to talk about giving opportunity for minority employment and for minority entrepreneurs, I cannot think of any industry which would be more capable of doing it than the voucher industry. So in 5 years, it would go. Now let's go to your question. What about school expenses, the city's expenses? It is true that if you made the voucher equal to the school's expenses, the school would lose on that deal. For 2 reasons. First, there are some students now who go to private schools and who cost the city nothing. And they would be entitled to vouchers. That's one of the main reasons for suggesting that the voucher be about half what it is now, because that gives you that leeway. But second, the figures I gave were not capital costs, but current operating costs of the schools. In addition to that, total capital costs, including amortization and interest, are higher than I've described. Those other costs will continue, but they aren't going to be affected one way or another. If you reduce the number of pupils in the schools, you will be able to reduce the ongoing current costs. You won't be, first of all, people will say, but you've got these contracts with teachers. How are you going to, what are you going to do about them? No problem. Because they will be shifting from the city school, public schools to the voucher schools as the voucher schools emerge. So you will simultaneously be reducing the burden on the city school and increasing the amount. It was entirely precisely to meet the kind of problem you're talking about now that we wanted to have demonstration projects in Connecticut and in New Hampshire in order to try these things out. And unfortunately, I am sorry we couldn't have some trial projects.
Well, I congratulate you for your imagination, your concept, and your presentation of both.
Thank you very much. I am sorry to say we're going to have to close this off. I wish we had more time, but our time is up. Thank you very much.